We're now ready to state one of the most beautiful and important theorems in all of social choice theory. This is Arrow's famous impossibility result. What the theorem says, roughly, is that there is no social welfare function that satisfies a certain set of very natural principles of group decision-making methods. So it's a very surprising result. We have these principles, they're very natural assumptions that you would want to impose on any good group decision-making method, but it turns out that these principles are jointly inconsistent. So let's take a look at the basic setup. We have a set of alternatives, a finite set of alternatives with at least three elements. It's important that we have at least three candidates. The theorem doesn't hold if we only have two candidates. And we also need to assume that there's a finite set of voters. So we have at least three alternatives or candidates and a finite set of voters. Now, a social welfare function is a way of associating with profiles some ordering over the set of candidates. So in order to specify a social welfare function, you first give a domain. This is the set of profiles that are currently under consideration. A profile is just a sequence of orderings, one for each voter. So you fix a set of profiles, and then a social welfare function associates for each one of the profiles in the domain some ordering over the set of candidates, the social ordering or the group ordering. As a reminder, O of X is the set of reflexive, transitive, and complete relations on X. What completeness means is that if you give me any two alternatives, A and B in X, either A is going to be ranked strictly ahead of B, B is going to be ranked strictly ahead of A, or there's an indifference between A and B. And if you give me a relation R in O of X, we're going to let P sub R denote the strict subrelation and I sub R denote the indifference subrelation. These relations are defined in the following way. A is strictly ahead of B, or strictly preferred to B, if and only if A is preferred to B, so A is related to B, but it's not the case that B is preferred to A, so B is related to A. And there's an indifference between A and B, according to R, if it's the case that A is preferred to B and B is preferred to A. So A is at least as good as B and B is at least as good as A. Now we are in a position where we can state the principles of group decision making. The first one is unanimity. What unanimity says is that if everybody ranks A strictly ahead of B, then society has to as well. It's a very natural assumption. Formally, what it says is if you give me any profile in the domain, if it's the case that for every single voter, the voter ranks A strictly ahead of B, then society has to rank A strictly ahead of B. So just one comment about the notation. Note P sub I here. This is the strict subrelation of R sub I. So R sub I is the ith component of the profile R. That's voter I's ordering. And P sub I denotes the strict subrelation of R sub I. So what this says is, if it's the case that everybody strictly ranks A ahead of B, then society has to rank A strictly ahead of B. So F of R is the social ordering associated with the profile R, and P sub F of R is the strict subrelation of that social ordering. So that's unanimity. The second natural assumption is that there is no restriction on the set of profiles. Voters are free to choose any ordering, any preference, any way of ranking the candidates that they want. Formally, what this means is that the domain of the social welfare function is the set OX to the n, the set of all possible profiles over the set of alternatives X. There's no restriction. We do not rule out any profile from the beginning. So that's universal domain. The second assumption or the third assumption rather, is independence of irrelevant alternatives. What this says is the social ranking of two alternatives A and B depends only on the relative rankings of A and B for each voter. So the idea here is, if you give me two profiles, R and R prime, so we have two profiles, R and R prime, and if it's the case that the relative ranking of A and B is exactly the same for those two profiles. So what that means is, let's look at profile R. We look at the voters. There's going to be some voters that rank A strictly ahead of B. There's going to be some voters that rank B strictly ahead of A. And there's going to be some voters that are indifferent between A and B. When we move to this other profile, R prime, the voters change their orderings regarding the other alternatives that are different than A and B. But the voters that ranked A strictly ahead of B in profile R also rank A strictly ahead of B in profile R prime. And the voters that rank B strictly ahead of A and R also rank B strictly ahead of A and R prime. And the voters that are indifferent between A and B and R also are indifferent between A and B and R prime. So their opinions about A and B are exactly the same in R and R prime. If that's the case, then society has to rank A and B in exactly the same way in profile R and in profile R prime. So if society ranks A strictly ahead of B given profile R, then it has to rank A strictly ahead of B given profile R prime, and vice versa. So the relative rankings of A and B depends only on what the voters feel about A and B, and not any other quote-unquote irrelevant alternatives, any other alternatives that are different than A and B. The last principle is that there is no dictator. What a dictator means is that a voter D is said to be a dictator if society strictly prefers A over B whenever D strictly prefers A over B. So it might be the case that D strictly prefers A over B, and there's some other people that strictly prefer A over B and others that don't strictly prefer A over B. But society sides with D in that case. Society also sides with D in the case in which D strictly prefers A to B, and everybody else has a differing opinion. Then society still will side with D. So formally what this says is that there's a voter D such that for any profile you give me, any profile whatsoever, if D strictly ranks A ahead of B, then society has to rank A strictly ahead of B. So this is one way in which a social welfare function could fail to be anonymous, because it's treating this one voter D in a very special way. So now we're ready to state Arrow's theorem. What Arrow's theorem says is, if we have at least 3 candidates and finitely many voters, then any social welfare function that satisfies universal domain, independence of irrelevant alternatives, and unanimity must be a dictatorship. So we can view this as characterizing a dictatorship. Another way to view it, to think of it as an impossibility result, is there cannot be any social welfare function that satisfies universal domain, independence of irrelevant alternatives, unanimity, and non-dictatorship. So it's a very, very surprising result. There are a number, as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of literature has stemmed from this beautiful result. I can recommend these 4 papers. This is a classic paper in the Handbook of Social Choice and Welfare that discusses the impossibility result and many different variants of it. This is a nice textbook on social choice theory. The Giannakopoulos paper provides you very short and concise proofs of the theorem. And finally, there's a nice article by Suppies that sketches some of the history of Arrow's impossibility result.